Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Welcome back to the Space Koala channel. I'm back with another video, and this time I have something that we've been waiting for such a long amount of time. It's been 2 years since it was initially introduced, and people have been waiting for it and asking for it periodically. And while we saw this at some astro fairs periodically, it's in my hand now and I get to try it out. Let's have a look. CAA stands for Camera Angle Adjuster, and it is just a rotator for your camera. Packaging, and it's here. I held it in my hand when I saw it at an astro show, but of course I couldn't try it before. I already saw the possibility on the ASI Air to add the CAA because I'm on the beta version of the software. And so tonight I will actually connect this to my telescope and see how it works. It is very sturdy. Since it hasn't been announced yet, I don't know any specifics about it, so I will have to just measure it and figure out how to use it. This bird is 16 millimeters, plus you have an adapter. With the adapter, you arrive to exactly 16.5 millimeters, which is an expected number because ZWO works in a way that they keep all the elements at either 21 millimeters or 16.5 millimeters so that everything is always working out to be the same back focus of 55 millimeters on their cameras. And what else do we have? There's another one of these adapter rings. So this is an M54. Yes. And this must be an M48. Exactly. So depending on your camera side connection, you can choose this or this interface. There is no M42 interface included. And then there is a box of accessories. There is a screwdriver. That is just to switch the adapter. And there is a USB-C cable. So let's have a look at the rotator itself. It is flat for the most part, except it has this thickened bottom part in that the construction is very similar to the ZWO filter wheel. On the bottom of this thicker part, you actually have a writing where it tells you that the camera goes on this side and the telescope goes on that side. So that is in line with what we said, that this is the camera side adapter, and then the female part is the telescope side adapter. That is an M54. Obviously, you can use standard adapter rings if your scope happens to be an M48. The camera that I will be using has the 54 millimeter interface, so I will leave this on. I don't need this one. I know that the weight might be a limiting factor for a lot of people's focusers, so let's weigh it on my professional standardized astronomy tool measuring scale. It is 460 grams. I've set up the CAA. I'll show you the whole setup and some considerations about how to connect it if you are using an ASI Air. In my setup, I'm using an ASI 2600 MC Air. Then I have a filter wheel on it. I realize not a lot of people use filter wheels on color cameras. I find it helpful if I have multiple filters, and it's also a good example of how you would connect it to a mono camera. And then I have the CAA. Let's count USB ports. Suppose you are using the regular separate ASI Air box setup with a cooled deep sky camera. That gives you a total of 6 USB ports, 4 on the ASI Air, 2 on the cooled camera. So you have 6 USB ports. Out of that, you have to connect your deep sky camera, your filter wheel, your focuser, the guide camera, the CAA, the mount. You run out of space, and potentially you also want to connect an external storage device, for example, which then you don't have any more USB ports for. If you're using the Air setup, then you have a total of 4 USB ports only. However, you are saving 2 USB ports because you don't need one for the separate guider anymore, and you don't need one for the camera. So you're exactly in the same situation, which means if you want to save a USB port, you can do it by connecting to your mount in a wireless manner. Also, if you are not using the internal guider system on here, then you would also need one additional USB port for that. So your option there is you need to get a powered USB splitter. I am using the built-in guidance sensor and the built-in ASI Air. So I have a total of 4 USB ports, but this is more than enough for me because I am connected to the mount via Bluetooth. So I actually have one USB port still free where I could connect like a storage device, which I usually tend to do. And then for the rest, I have everything connected. Let me show you. I have this CAA directly on the telescope, and then I have the filter wheel behind it, and then finally the camera. So all I had to do compared to my previous setup that I had on here was just to remove the spacer of 16.5 millimeters and put the CAA in place of that. You just twist it on. Okay, so now I've polar lined the mount and we can get into checking out the CAA. I have one of these hand controllers that they sell for the EAF, and I saw that the connector port is suspiciously similar looking. So I plugged it in, lo and behold, it rotates. And also if you change it to the slow mode, then it rotates very, very slowly. I think that this is an extremely niche use case that someone would want to use an electronic rotator with a hand controller, but I think it's nice that you can do it. Now, what is more important is let's check how it works with the ASI Air. So I'll be recording my screen. I have connected everything already, with the exception of the CAA, because I wanted to show you what happens when you connect it. Just like all the other tools, if you have one connected, it recognizes it and then you just turn it on. And then this warning comes up, asking you to check whether your guide camera rotates with your main camera. What this is asking you really is, are you using a separate guide scope, or are you using an off-axis guider or one of these ZWO sensors? Why is it asking you? Because when you rotate the main camera, if your guide camera is here, then doesn't matter what you do back here, the angle between the sky and the guiding sensor will not change. However, if it's on here and then you rotate the entire thing, then normally if you rotate by hand, you have to recalibrate the guiding. That's what I have to do today without the CAA. If I have to rotate my camera, I have to recalibrate my guiding. This is quite nice that they do this for you automatically, because it means that you can set up a plan with 2 targets with 2 different orientations, and every night you can go back to the same 2 angles, and you don't even have to recalibrate in between. And so in my case, it is a yes. And then it also asks you, does the calibration data reverse the rotation? And what this is asking you is your telescope giving you a mirror image of the sky? It is not the case for this telescope, but they actually help you decide by asking you how many optical elements your telescope has. So that is us done. Let's try to see what we can actually do with it. I will just do a plate solve so that it understands the initial direction. This is very much out of focus. In any case, I will do a plate solve and I will sync. I cannot sync the mount, but anyway, I've synced this at least. And then I will do a go to. Let's do something. There's the moon that is not helping. Let's do something up here. Like the Heart and Soul Nebula. This is a perfect example because we are looking at it from this angle, which is not very nice. I'm doing a go to. And it shows this direction. But what I can also do is I want to rotate it like this and move it a bit further this way. And I can do a go to. So first it does the go to the center of the new image. And once it found it, it says CAA rotating. And it automatically rotates it into the position that you wanted. Well, one thing to pay attention to here, it is a good idea to check if the rotator or your entire camera setup is free to move all around, because I know for a fact that here, with this very short telescope, I have to set it up in a certain way so that this wouldn't touch on here. This can also be the case for a tripod, especially if you have the legs. It is not likely to be a problem if you don't have a filter wheel. Anyway, so that's really cool. And so this is already saving the rotation here. So if I say, by the way, I think that I'm so out of focus because I wanted to use a narrowband filter. Let me just take a picture with a narrowband filter. It is in focus, and in fact, we're barely seeing the stars now. So what I'm going to do is show you what happens in plan mode. Let me just reset this test from the other day that I did. I'm in plan mode, and I will say, okay, I want to take this picture. But then, after a few hours, the Orion Nebula will come up. And so I also want to add that to the plan. Actually, it's already up. It's just covered by the mountains. I want to take a picture of this. However, I definitely don't like this orientation, and therefore already here, I can say that I want to rotate it like this, and I add it to the plan. What this does is when you're looking at your plan that you have, a couple of captures here so that we can activate them. I have 2 targets in my plan, and you see that unlike in the past where you only saw the right ascension and declination coordinates here, now we also have the angle. So what it means is it does the first target, then you can go away from the telescope, you can go to sleep, and then in the middle of the night when it switches, it automatically rotates to that position again. So we have seen how the CAA can rotate your camera on demand. You can put that in the plan, you can do all those kinds of things. But what happens if you have to rotate your camera back into a specific direction when the stars are not available because it's daytime or you're inside? You can also do that, because inside the CAA, if you scroll down from all this text that we've seen before, there is a manual control, and it is showing you the current way that it's pointed at. It also tells you the last time that it was updated by PlateSolve was at that time, and then I can adjust this manually. I mean, you can do it all around. Let me just rotate it by this much, and I click on rotate. If you want to rotate your camera back into a specific position because you want to take your flats afterwards, you can also just write the number in here. And I know, for example, that I was shooting at 85.9 degrees. I can put that back, and it takes not even 2 seconds to rotate. So that concludes the 3 ways you can use the CAA to rotate your camera. So that was manually with the hand controller, using anything in the software that does a PlateSolve, or manually rotating it via the app specifying the angle. Now you might wonder if there's a risk of the cables getting tangled if you leave the telescope there to do its thing and you have multiple rotations overnight, but actually the firmware should take care of it. They have this anti-winding algorithm, so let's try that. If I go from here to here, for example, the idea is that it should remember that it had come from a specific location. So if I go further, it should keep going forward. But then if I go back near the original position, it should not rotate all the way. See, now it would be shorter for it to go this way, but I expect that it should know that it's going to go backwards. So in fact, this is working, so it is quite safe as long as you have a minimum amount of allowance for the cables to go 360 degrees once. It is guaranteed that it's not going to rotate more than that, so you will not have the cables tangled and wound up all around multiple times. That was the quickest equipment testing I've ever done. Overall, everything just worked the first time around. It does exactly what it is supposed to do. It does what it says on the box. Now, What are the pros and cons of having such a rotator in your system? The pros, obviously, that you can make it much easier to rotate your camera into a specific angle. This, of course, can be useful, especially if you don't already have a rotator in your system, like if your focuser cannot rotate or you don't have a way of doing that. That is always useful. However, what I think is the biggest plus is that now when you are using an ASI Air and you're using the plan mode for the night, you can have different targets at different angles. This is something that will be very useful to me because in the winter months, when you have many hours of darkness, I often end up dividing the night into two and always just shoot the target that is up high. So I will shoot one target for 4 hours and then another target for another 4 hours or 5 hours. This will make it so easy to do that, and I can have different rotations. So far, when I was doing that using the plan mode of the ASI Air, I was always choosing pairs of targets that would work with the same rotation. For this will make it much easier to always just choose whatever object you want. You can always just rotate the camera in a different way. So that really sums up the pros, which are really just the actual features of the device. And of course, finally, we have a rotator that works also with the ASI Air. Now, in terms of cons, it is hard to think of what the con is in terms of a disadvantage or a drawback. I would have to think about it more in the sense of things that you have to consider before thinking of adding one of these to your system. And there are a couple of things that you should think about. First and foremost, the back focus requirements. The rotator itself is 16.5 millimeters. So if you are currently using a 16.5 spacer ring, that is a no-brainer because you can just swap that out. However, if you already have your optical train back focus maxed out with other tools and devices, then you have to start thinking about how you can accommodate a rotator and whether you really want to do that. So, for example, the system that I had today, I had the camera with the built-in guidance sensor, then I had the filter wheel, and then I had the rotator. This worked like a charm, and then I had 2 millimeters remaining, which I just put like a spacer there. So I arrived to my 55 millimeter back focus. That was the requirement of the telescope that I was using. If you have less than 55 millimeters, obviously you have to see if you even have space for it. Or if you're using both a filter wheel and an off-axis guider, then unless you have a longer back focus on your telescope than the 55 millimeters, there will be no space for the rotator. I will be using the rotator on the ZWO camera that I showed you, and I will be using the rotator also with other camera systems on the telescopes that I have that have much longer back focuses. However, if I want to use my 6200 mm full frame camera, which also has obviously the filter wheel and an off-axis guider, if I want to use that camera on a telescope that has a 55 millimeter back focus, I wouldn't be able to do that. So in that case, I would opt out of the rotator. I think that the idea of ZWO there is that people will be using the ZWO cameras with the two sensors so that you don't need an OAG, so that you will always have space for the CAA. However, I would not put that on my Celestron C14 with the focal length of 4 meters if I'm using a narrow band filter, because it will just not find any guide stars. If you insist on using an OAG and the filter wheel and you have a back focus of 55 millimeters, you will not be able to use the CAA. Whereas if you're happy using a separate guide scope, you can replace the OAG for the CAA should you wish to. Similarly to the back focus, another thing to consider prior to ordering is whether the whole CAA physically fits onto your focuser, meaning if you have a very large focuser, for example, I have one of my favorite telescopes, a Newtonian, that has a 3-inch paracar corrector, and then I have an adapter on there, that it's not because of the back focus that it doesn't fit, but because of the physical diameter of the adapter on the focuser. But this is also something to keep in mind, because I cannot imagine anything more frustrating than ordering this, because you calculate that the back focus is fine and then you're not able to physically twist it on because the bottom protruding part of the CAA just touches your focuser. So that is also something to keep in mind. And then finally, just a general consideration. You have to keep in mind that the camera will rotate while you're not there. First of all, if you use a traditional German equatorial mount, especially if you're very near the weight limit, meaning you have to be extremely precise with the balancing. If you have an asymmetrical system like one with a filter wheel, you have to consider that it will rotate and the balance situation will change a tiny bit when that happens. I think you only have to worry about this if today you find that you have to balance your telescope after you have rotated your camera. And second thing that will impact everybody, just make sure that you have clearance everywhere, because you don't want your camera to rotate in the middle of the night and then suddenly your filter wheel is going to be touching your pier or the legs of your tripod. Third point, which once again impacts everybody, when you do your cable management, make sure that you leave the cables loose enough to allow them to accommodate the rotation of the camera later on in the night, because you don't want to have your cables snug and very tight and just getting snagged on something. The one thing I wonder is what other functionalities they could add to the CAA in the future. I'm wondering if it could be used as a derotator for using any mount in alt azimuth, even with the ASI Air, for those out there that are just switching from a smart telescope to a more traditional rig, but they just don't want a polar line. But even if you've polar lined, but not very accurately, so you have a little bit of a rotation over time, it could still be used to kind of correct the field rotation related to that. I think that sums up pretty much all of my thoughts and considerations about the Rotator. After all, on paper, it is a simple device, and knowing ZWO, whatever comes out and is compatible with the ASI Air is usually plug and play, and it was like that, even if it is still in the beta stage and my unit is still just a pre-production test unit, it was already working perfectly. So once again, they have come out with something that just works, and whether you want to actually add this to your optical train, you will just have to evaluate based on all these things that I mentioned, and I don't know, there might be other considerations that I didn't think about. Like I said, I was very happy with it. It works exactly as it should, and I will keep using it on some of my systems. I don't think there's a whole lot of information about the Rotator out there, so let me know what you thought now that we got to see it in action a little bit, and let me know if it lived up to your expectations or you were expecting it to be different, better, worse, whatever. As for me, the weather forecast promises nice weather over the new moon, so I am super excited because I have so many targets planned, and I hope that it will be like that for many of you as well. So until next time, I wish you clear skies.